I'll tell you how it started. Because nobody else's will. Phil is dead. That's the first thing you need to understand. Phil Nakamura, 16 years on the force, father of 2 daughters, kept a photograph of a brown trout he'd caught in '89 taped inside his locker door. He told me once he'd caught it upstate during a weekend off, on a river he'd found by driving until the road ran out, and then walking in the direction the water sounded loudest. He was proud of that. The finding of it, not just the catching. Phil is dead, and the thing that killed him went out a 6th-floor window and walked away. And when I filed my report and told Director Calmette exactly what I'd seen, he looked at me the way you look at a man who's had one too many at the department. Christmas party. Patient, a little sad, waiting for me to finish embarrassing myself. You've had a shock, he said. Take some personal days. I told him I didn't want personal days. I wanted to know what killed my partner, he said. We're looking into it. That was a lie. I knew it was a lie because I'd already been to the morgue, and what they'd put on Phil's death certificate was blunt force trauma, accidental. Phil's chest had been compressed from the front with something like a hydraulic press. There was nothing accidental about it. Someone had stood in front of him and squeezed. And the examiner, a quiet woman named Doris who'd been doing this work since before I was born, looked at me when she said it and then looked away very deliberately, the way people do when they want you to understand they're reading from a script. I drove home. I sat in my apartment with the lights off and I thought about what I'd seen. I have an apartment on the 7th floor of a building in the administrative district that I've occupied for 11 years without doing much to it. There are books I've read and books I haven't, and a kitchen I use for coffee and nothing else, and a window that looks out over a street that never entirely goes quiet. I've sat in that apartment after bad nights before, after crime scenes that took something from you, after cases that ended in ways that should not have been the ending. I have a particular way of sitting in the dark that isn't depression and isn't ritual. It's just the thing you do when you need to let the day settle before you can sleep. And I've been doing it long enough that the chair I use for it has a shape that is mostly mine now. That night I couldn't settle. I kept running the sequence. Phil's voice, level, commanding, the 2 rounds. The amber eyes, one hand. I kept trying to find the error in my observation. The angle that would make it something else. The chain of events that would resolve into an explanation I already had vocabulary for. I'm a rational man. I've been a rational man through a long career that has shown me that most things, when you look at them correctly, have a rational explanation. I've always believed that. I believed it sitting in the dark that night, which is why I kept looking for the explanation, and why its absence was so specifically disturbing. He had walked through 2 rounds, center mass, and kept coming. That's not physiology, that's not psychology. That's not any failure of aim or equipment that I can construct, because I know what a hit looks like, and I know what I saw. Whatever Phil and I walked into on Voss Street, it was something that my training and my 26 years of accumulated professional knowledge had not prepared me for. And I am old enough and experienced enough to know that the correct response to that is not to decide my observation must be wrong. The correct response is to acknowledge the territory is larger than the map and start from there. I wrote out what I'd seen. Then I went to bed. I did not sleep. The man, and I'm calling it a man for convenience, because it had 2 arms and 2 legs and wore a black coat, had been standing over the woman when we came in. She was suspended from the ceiling of an abandoned warehouse on Voss Street, 2 puncture wounds in her neck, blood pooled in a bucket below her, with the clinical precision of someone who'd done this many times and found a method that worked. The man turned around. His eyes caught the light from Phil's flashlight and held it wrong. Not the brief retinal flash you get from a dog or a cat, but a steady, amber glow, like the light was being processed by something that didn't need it, but appreciated the gesture. Phil told him to freeze. Phil was good at his job. He had 18 months on me in terms of tactical instinct. And when a situation went sideways, his hands did what they were supposed to do before his mind finished the sentence. He didn't hesitate. He didn't telegraph. He had his weapon out and his voice was level. The man walked toward him. Phil fired twice, center mass. I saw both rounds connect. I know the sound. I know the way the fabric moves. I know what a hit looks like from 8 feet away after 26 years. The man didn't stumble. He didn't grunt. He continued forward with the same measured pace, as if the impacts were a mild inconvenience he'd mentally filed and set aside. He reached Phil in 3 steps, put one hand flat on Phil's chest, and pressed. Phil made a sound I will not describe. Then the man looked at me over Phil's shoulder, tilted his head a degree or two. Curious, I would say later, not threatened, and went through the window behind him. 6th floor, I ran to the window and looked down. He was gone, not fallen and crawled away. Gone. The street below was empty and still, and the only sound was a distant tram 2 blocks over. I am 52 years old. I have been a detective for 26 of those years. I have worked homicides, organized crime, a classified domestic surveillance task force that technically doesn't exist and whose files are routed through a ministry subdepartment with a name that doesn't appear on any public organizational chart. I have seen a great many things that frightened me and a great many more that merely disgusted me. Feistas. What I felt watching that man walk through the window was something different. It was the specific call of a man who has just understood that his map is wrong, that the territory is larger and stranger than anything the map accounts for, and that he has been navigating by a document that was never complete to begin with. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote out what I'd observed in the order I'd observed it, in the precise language I use for witness statements. And I read it back to myself 3 times, and each time it said the same thing. 2 bullets, center mass, no effect. 1 hand, 6th floor, gone. The summons came the following morning. Not a message, not a call. 2 men in the kind of suits that announce institutional authority without displaying any particular insignia, standing outside my door at 7:15. They were polite. They drove a black car. They took me to a building I'd passed 100 times without thinking much about it. A gray concrete structure off the main administrative district, with narrow windows and the flag of the Interior Ministry above the entrance. The lobby was marble and echoed. The elevator was slow. Director Calmet's office was on the 4th floor. He was a compact man, 50s, with the stillness of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. The kind of stillness that comes not from tranquility, but from a long career of absorbing difficult facts without visible reaction, because visible reactions cost you politically, and politically is how you survive in this city's administrative apparatus. Deputy Director Seward sat to his left, younger, more angular, a precise and watchful quality about him that I didn't like immediately and liked less as time went on. He had the focus of a man who was always calculating something, and whose calculation was running 1 level below whatever conversation he appeared to be having. Calmet poured coffee. He let me sit. He told me, in the tone of a man reading from a prepared text, that the situation I had encountered the previous evening was more complex than it appeared. There is a population, he said, that we have been aware of for some time. A genetically distinct group. They have coexisted with the general population in concealed fashion for centuries. In the last several years, under the leadership of a figure they call the Elder, a significant contingent of this population has approached various governmental bodies with a proposal. They wish to come out of hiding. They wish integration. Propose a period of managed disclosure, a legal framework, a bilateral enforcement arrangement. He paused to let that settle. They have offered, in exchange, considerable assistance with certain security concerns. They have their own law enforcement apparatus. They are willing to share intelligence and coordinate operations. I asked him what he was telling me. I'm telling you, Calmet said, that the individual responsible for Detective Nakamura's death is one of this population, a rogue, acting against the explicit stated policy of their leadership. They want him found as much as we do, more perhaps, since he threatens everything they've been building toward for a decade. What are they? I asked. Calmet said the word the way you say the name of a disease you've been treating for years, without cure. Not with drama, not with apology, just with the flat resignation of a man who has accepted an inconvenient reality and integrated it into his daily operations. Vampires. There was a long silence. Through the narrow window behind his desk, the gray city moved in its gray way. I'm assigning you a partner from their community, Calmet said. His name is Aaron Gray. He is their liaison officer, and he has full investigative authority within the terms of the preliminary accord. You will work the case together. You will share findings at each stage. You will not pursue independent action. I asked what happened if I declined. Seward smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has already thought through your available options and found them limited. Calmette said, the case stays open. Phil's file stays the way it is. You go back to your desk. I thought about that photograph in Phil's locker, the trout, the year he'd found that river by following the sound of the water. When do I meet him? I said. Aaron Gray was waiting in the lobby. He was tall, pale in the particular way that isn't pallor, but is instead the absence of the small color variations that sun and weather put into human skin over time. A consistent, even, almost polished tone, like a material that had never been exposed to the ordinary erosions. His hair was dark and cut practically. His suit was well cut and dark gray. He stood with the loose-limbed ease of something that has never in its life been genuinely afraid of a physical threat. And he looked at me when I came off the elevator, with a steadiness that wasn't quite arrogance, and wasn't quite warmth. It was the look of someone waiting to be judged, and prepared to be patient about the process. Detective Grant, he said. Mr. Gray, I said. We shook hands. His grip was firm, and his skin was cool. Not cold, not alarming, but the coolness of a man who had been standing in a shaded lobby rather than the ambient temperature a living body maintains through continuous metabolic work. I noted it. I did not comment on it. We went to the first crime scene together. And on the drive I did what I always do with a new partner, which is talk very little and watch how they move through space. What they look at first, whether their instincts and mine align enough to be useful. Gray looked out the window at the city and made no small talk. He asked two specific questions about the timeline of the previous night's events. What time exactly the woman had been found. What time Phil had been killed. And then he was quiet. Shh. The questions were good. Questions an investigator asks when they're building a picture and need the foundational measurements before they start framing the walls. The warehouse on Voss Street had been processed and nominally cleared. We had access because Gray had a clearance code that made the patrol officer on the door step back and stop asking questions. Inside, the suspended frame where the woman had been hung was still in place. The bucket had been removed. The blood had been partially cleaned, but incompletely. The smell was still there. That particular copper and iron scent that you never fully lose, from a room where someone has bled in quantity. A smell that has followed me home from enough scenes over the years that I have a specific way of standing in it, without breathing through my nose until my body forgets to think about it. Gray crouched beside the frame and studied the connection points where the cable had been anchored. He was very still. He looked at the anchor for a long time, then at the angle of the suspension, then at the bucket placement. This is Cross's work, he said. He said the name with the flat certainty of recognition, not inference. Not this looks like, not this is consistent with. The way you say the name of someone you've known for a long time. I asked how he knew. The method, he said, the framing. Cross has a particular aesthetic about his kills. He's been doing this for a long time and he's developed preferences. You could call them signatures. He paused. He would be offended to hear it put that way. He considers himself an artist, which is the kind of thing that someone with centuries and not enough accountability tells himself. That's the rogue? One of them, Gray said. He stood and turned to look at me. There's a network. Cross isn't operating alone. He has ideological support from a faction within our community that opposes integration. They believe coexistence with humans is a form of surrender, that it introduces obligations and constraints that diminish what they are. Cross is the instrument. Someone else is directing him. I asked if he had a name for the someone else. He looked at me for a moment with an expression that was careful and considered. Not yet, he said. He was lying. I knew it immediately. Not from any dramatic tell, but from the slight compression of the word, the deliberate quality of it. He was telling me a truth he'd decided to give me, and holding back the part he hadn't decided about yet. I filed it. I did not press. You learn, working homicides, that the information you push for too early disappears. People close around it defensively. You let them carry it a while, and Sometimes they set it down somewhere accessible without meaning to, and you pick it up then. We spent the morning going through what official documentation existed on the case, which was limited and had been further limited by someone with access to the filing system. The NSA had been monitoring Cross's activities for some time, but had confined their response to surveillance on the grounds that aggressive action might destabilize the integration negotiation. 3 women dead. Surveillance continued. 2 more women dead. Surveillance continued. Phil dead. At this point, they had decided that perhaps a more active approach was warranted. The documentation was sanitized. I noticed the gaps, places where the logical next entry should have been and wasn't. Sequence breaks that meant something had been removed rather than not yet filed. References in later documents to events that should have generated earlier reports. Gray noticed me noticing the gaps and nothing. Seward's hand was in this. The deputy director had clearly been managing the information flow, deciding what the case file contained and what it didn't, ensuring that the integration process wasn't complicated by the public scale of what had actually been happening. 5 women dead over 8 months. A pattern that should have generated a task force. Instead, it had generated a file with holes in it and a patrol officer on the door of the first crime scene who'd been there 12 hours before anyone called me. I asked Gray over a lunch I ate, and he didn't know how long Cross had been killing. Here, he said, 8 months. And before here, he looked at his untouched water glass. He had ordered water because I'd asked if he wanted anything, and he had ordered water to have something in front of him. Didn't miss that. Cross is old, he said, very old. He was present during historical periods that would disturb you. Try me, I said. Gray was quiet for a moment, turning the water glass slightly on the table, and then setting it level again. Then he said, he was in the camps, not as a prisoner. He was feeding during the period of the camps, and he found the conditions efficient. The word he used, in the account I was shown, was efficient. The logistics of it suited him. The word landed with the weight of someone who has had decades to sit with a fact, and has not yet found the right container for it, and probably never will. Several of our kind faced situations like that in the last century. Survived things that broke human beings entirely. Some of them came through with their ethics intact. A hard thing to manage, ethics, across centuries. Humans struggle with them across decades, and you start fresh each generation. We carry ours a long time. Some of us tend them well. Some find reasons to let them go. I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Lucy C. Wenra came into the investigation on the 3rd day. She arrived at the precinct office we'd been assigned. A disused conference room in a building that officially housed a licensing bureau. 3 floors of dreary administrative process, with our work hidden in the middle of it like something embarrassing, in the way that certain people arrive in rooms. Which is to say that the room reorganized itself around her entrance, without her appearing to try. She was small and moved with the coiled efficiency of someone who has learned to occupy very little space and can abandon that practice at short notice. She set a folder on the table between me and Gray and said that she represented the elder's office directly, and that she had information the investigation needed. Gray looked at the folder. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was not entirely readable to me. Not hostility, but the wariness of 2 people who share an institutional world with complicated internal politics, and know exactly where they each stand in it. Does the elder want, he said. Resolution, she said, clean and fast. The negotiation with the Interior Ministry reaches its critical phase in 11 days. The elder's position is that Cross needs to be found, arrested, tried under our law, and the result made available to the ministry as a confidential disclosure, a demonstration that we police ourselves, that we are capable of it. And if we find Cross and the trail leads somewhere it's inconvenient to follow, I said, somewhere that complicates the negotiation rather than tidying it up. She looked at me. It was the first time she'd really looked at me directly, and there was something in it that was assessing in a way that went further than the surface. Like being read rather than seen, as if she were taking the measure of something she'd been told about, and was now deciding whether the information was accurate. Then we follow the evidence where it goes, she said. That's what I'm here to ensure. The folder contained surveillance photographs, intercept summaries, and one name. Boudreaux. An intermediary, a logistics figure within the anti-integration faction, who had been running operational support for Cross, safe houses, transport arrangements, a network of human collaborators who were being paid to look the other way or actively provide assistance. The Elder's intelligence apparatus had been sitting on this for weeks, not months, Westenra told me when I asked, because they hadn't had it confirmed for months. Weeks. They'd had it confirmed for weeks and sat on it. I picked up the folder and read through it carefully, and then I put it back down. Why didn't you bring this to us 3 days ago? I said. Westenra said, politics. People died while you were doing politics, I said. She didn't look away, and she didn't apologize. She held the weight of it without flinching, which I gave her credit for. It's a harder thing than it looks, to hold a fact like that and meet the person holding it with you. Yes, she said. They did, I know. There are people in our leadership who will answer for that decision. Right now, the relevant question is what we do with what's in this folder. I took the folder. Gray and I brought Boudreaux in the following afternoon. He was a middle-aged man in a good suit who operated as a private transport broker out of an office above a cafe in the commercial district. The kind of man whose business card and physical premises announced respectability, while his actual revenue streams ran through entirely different channels. We came through the door. He reached for his desk phone, and Gray reached across the desk and removed the phone from his hand without touching the desk, without knocking anything over, without any particular visible effort. The motion was so smooth and so unhurried that for a moment Boudreaux looked at his empty hand, as if the phone had simply chosen to leave. Shh. Then he looked at Gray. Then he became very still. In the way that prey animals become still when they understand the situation precisely. Conducted the interview. Gray sat in the corner. I've learned, over the years, that the most useful thing a second officer can do in an interview room is nothing. Just be present, not visibly threatening, occupying space in a way that the subject's mind fills with their own projections. Trust. What you project into a quiet corner depends on what you're afraid of, and what Boudreaux was afraid of was sitting in that corner wearing Gray's face. He didn't take his eyes off Gray for the first 20 minutes, and then gradually, as I kept asking him questions in a conversational and patient way, he shifted his attention to me, which is what I wanted. I asked him about logistics, about routes, about the practical mechanics of moving someone who didn't want to be found through a city with surveillance infrastructure at every transit point. I asked him about specific dates, about specific vehicles, about the names of the people who'd driven those vehicles. I let him tell me the parts he was comfortable telling me, and I noted the parts he skipped, and I came back to those later, when his guard had come down 3 or 4 degrees, which is when the useful information starts to slip through. There is a rhythm to a good interrogation that most people who haven't done it don't understand. It's not confrontational, it's not theatrical. It's patient, and it's specific, and it proceeds on the assumption that the person across from you has information they will give you if you give them enough conversational surface to set it down on. You ask about the practical details, the logistics, the unremarkable operational facts. What time, what vehicle, what route, because those questions carry low emotional stakes, and the subject answers them more freely, and in answering them, they establish a rhythm of answering that makes the harder questions easier to approach. You build a transaction. Small truths in exchange for your attention and your patience. Then you make the transaction larger by increments, so small the subject doesn't notice the price going up. Boudreaux was intelligent, which made him easier in some ways and harder in others. He understood the mechanics of what I was doing. He could see the shape of the approach. But understanding an approach and resisting it are different skills. And intelligence sometimes works against you in an interrogation because the intelligent mind generates rationalizations. Reasons why it's acceptable to answer this question. Reasons why the next one is probably inevitable anyway. Reasons why cooperation serves the larger interest. I let Boudreaux's intelligence work for me. I gave him room to construct the rationalizations, and I was patient while he constructed them, and when he'd finished I was still there, waiting for the next answer. He gave us the first safe house address in 32 minutes. He gave us the second address in 45. He gave us the name of the human contact within the ministry who had been blocking internal escalation of the case, not Calmet, who appeared to be genuinely ignorant of the scale of it, but a figure above Calmet, a figure in the part of the ministry that officially did not conduct domestic operations and whose budget lines ran 3 different sub-departments before they became untraceable. In under an hour we had the shape of the thing. He did not give us the name at the top. He said he didn't know it. I believed him, which was frustrating. In the specific way, it is frustrating to believe a man who is giving you everything he has, and it still isn't enough. The network had been compartmentalized carefully. Boudreaux knew the logistics layer, and the logistics layer only. The architecture above him was invisible to him by design. We drove to the first safe house. It was in a residential district of tired pre-war buildings and tired pre-war light. The kind of neighborhood where people mind their business aggressively, where nobody watches the street and nobody remembers seeing anything. The apartment was empty, but recently vacated. There was warmth in the bedding, food in an opened tin on the counter, a coat left on a hook by the door that nobody leaves unless they're leaving faster than they planned. Cross had been here within hours. He knows we have Boudreaux, Gray said. I asked how that was possible. Gray looked at the coat on the hook for a long moment. It was a good coat. Old, well cared for. Because someone told him. Someone in the building we just came from. I thought about Seward's precise, watchful smile. The way he'd been calculating something slightly below the surface of every exchange. The way the case file had been managed. We drove back to the ministry building. Seward's office was empty. Personal documents had been removed. Not hurriedly, not in visible disorder, but with a methodical thoroughness that suggested advanced preparation. His desk was clean. His drawers were empty. The photographs that had been on the credenza behind him were gone. He had known this was coming, and he had built his exit into the plan from the beginning. Which means he had been running a parallel track the whole time we'd been working, watching the investigation proceed, and waiting for the moment it got close enough to require him to move. Calmet was in his office. He looked at me, and then at Gray, and then at Westenra, who had come with us, and who stood in the doorway with the stillness of someone watching a structure they had suspected was unstable confirm the diagnosis in real time. His face settled into the expression of a man who has just understood that the ground beneath a structure he has been maintaining for a long time is not what he thought it was. Where is Seward? I said. Calmet said he left an hour ago. He mentioned a medical appointment. I put Boudreaux's written statement on the desk. I put the surveillance intercepts on top of it. I told Calmet what Seward had been doing, how long, how systematically, with what resources, and at whose direction. Not Cross's direction. Cross was the instrument, not the architect. Not Seward's own ambition, though ambition had made him useful. Figure at the top was someone who had been present at every stage of the integration negotiation, who had seen the terms being drafted and the timelines established, who understood exactly what was at stake, and who had decided that integration posed a structural risk that outweighed any benefit. Not because they feared humans, but because they feared the legal constraints that a bilateral framework would impose on their own kind. To Calmet read the documents. He was thorough, and he was quiet, and his face didn't move much. But his hands, I noticed, went very still. The elder, he said. Not a question. A man arriving at the conclusion that seemed, to him, most logical. No, Westenra said from behind me. Her voice was quiet. Not the elder. Someone who has been using the elder's name and the elder's authority without the elder's knowledge. Someone much older and considerably less interested in compromise. Gray said, Orlok. The name sat in the room like something physical. I'd seen it once in the documentation, a doctor. Orlok, listed as a research consultant attached to the integration negotiation, a technical advisor on matters of biology and historical record, a minor figure in the paperwork. Unremarkable. The kind of name that appears in the margins of official documents and attracts no particular attention, precisely because it has been arranged to attract no attention. Gray sat down in the chair, across from Calmet's desk, which surprised me. It was the first time I'd seen him do anything that read as the weight of something landing on him. He sat down slowly, and he looked at the middle distance for a moment, like a man revising a calculation that had been based on an assumption he'd trusted too long. He said, Orlok has been running this from both sides for 30 years. He convinced the elder that integration was not only possible but necessary, and then he built and funded the faction that opposed it, because a failed integration attempt, a public visible collapse, a rogue killer the vampires couldn't control and the humans couldn't stop, would achieve exactly what he wanted. Not war. War is messy and uncertain, and it costs the things you're trying to preserve. Orlok wanted was managed separation, defined territories, clean borders, permanent legal distinction. The Elder's hands permanently tied by a negotiation that would be seen to have failed because of vampire violence. And the virus, Westenra said. She said it quietly, like something she'd been carrying and was now setting down. I asked what virus. There was a silence that had a different quality than the silences before it. The kind of silence that happens when people in a room know something they've decided not to say until they have to. And they've just decided they have to. Gray said, there is a pathogen. It was developed during the negotiation as a bilateral failsafe. The premise was that if integration collapsed entirely and open conflict became inevitable, both sides would hold a mutual deterrent, a reason to keep talking rather than fighting. The framework was designed by committee, and it was always naive. Orlok saw what it was immediately. He saw that a failsafe in a bilateral framework only functions as long as both sides control their own versions of it, and neither side weaponizes development. He began funding a variant, a version that would be lethal to humans and leave vampires unaffected. A weapon, I said. A leverage instrument, Gray said. That's how Orlok would describe it. Not interested in extinction. He understands the ecosystem well enough to know that a world without humans is a world he wouldn't enjoy living in. What he wants is the negotiating table to look different. Humans agreeing to separation terms under the shadow of that capability, or not agreeing, and then learning what non-agreement means. The Elder would be horrified. Most of our community would be horrified. That's irrelevant from Orlok's position, because Orlok operates on a longer timeline than most of our community thinks in. Where is the development facility? I said. Nobody answered immediately. Where is the facility? I said again, not louder, harder. Westenra said, we don't know. The Elder's intelligence operation has been trying to locate it for 6 months. The research record was constructed to be unfindable. The scientist involved worked under compartmentalized authorization. His location was never filed in any document that referenced the actual work. His supplies were routed through Boudreaux's network, undercover transport entries that we've only now been able to read clearly. Fleming, Gray said. He wasn't looking at Westenra. He was looking at the floor. Then he raised his eyes to me. The scientist's name is Fleming. He was a ministry researcher who disappeared from public record 2 years ago. His file says sabbatical. His colleagues were told he'd taken a position abroad. He paused. Detective. I believe Fleming is in this building. The silence that followed was of a particular quality. Sublevel 3, Gray said. There are levels to this building that are not on the public schematic. I've known for some time that Sublevel 3 existed. I did not know what it contained. Calmet looked like a man revising the entire biography of the place he'd worked for 15 years. We found Orlok at the Sublevel 3 access point, in a gray corridor that smelled of filtered air and old concrete. Not finding him there by coincidence. He was there because he'd known, with the patience of someone who has run operations across decades, that Boudreaux would eventually be compromised, and that the thread would lead here, and that the moment of confrontation was better managed on his terms than on the terms events would impose if he waited. He had come to this corridor to manage the moment. He was standing with his hands behind his back, unhurried, as if he'd been there a while. He was old. That was the immediate impression. Not old in the way that Calmet was old, or that the senior officers I'd known in my career were old, but old in the way that certain buildings are old, the way stone worn smooth by centuries of water is old. He was slight and still, and he watched us come down the corridor with an expression of mild, almost academic interest. The interest of a man watching an experiment reach its predicted conclusion. He said, Detective Grant, I've heard considerable good about your persistence. Your species has that quality in abundance. I've always found it remarkable, genuinely remarkable, that an organism without enhanced sensory capability, without accelerated healing, without a lifespan sufficient to accumulate meaningful institutional memory, can navigate a conspiracy of this complexity and arrive, more or less intact, at the correct door. You sound surprised, I said.
Not surprised.
Admiring, there's a difference. I never underestimate humans, Detective. Psst, that's where many of my contemporaries make their error. They see the obvious deficits, the fragility, the brevity, the blunt emotional architecture, the way every generation has to relearn the same lessons the previous one paid for, and they extrapolate from deficit to incapacity. I know better. I've watched your kind for a very long time. I've seen what individual humans can do when the case, as you might put it, matters enough to them. Long enough, I said, to watch you build a weapon to use against us. Something shifted in his expression. Not embarrassment, not guilt. The mild recalibration of someone whose framing has been challenged by a characterization he considers imprecise. Tool, he said, not a weapon. A tool for reordering an arrangement that has always been structurally unstable. Humans and vampires sharing a city sea, sharing legal infrastructure, sharing a pretense of equality. You understand how that ends, Detective. The history of integration between distinct populations does not have a happy chapter. Institutions absorb the other, categorize it, and eventually the category becomes a cage. I'm not building a weapon. I'm building a reason to negotiate honestly, rather than from the position of the weaker party, asking the stronger party to be generous. Fleming is in there, I said, nodding toward the sub-level access door. Fleming is finishing his work, Orlok said. He entered this arrangement willingly. He wanted immortality. He was offered it in exchange for his expertise, and he accepted. I don't compel. I provide what people want, and they provide what I need. You provided Cross with victims, I said. He looked at me steadily. Cross required latitude. He had ideological utility. The cost was managed within acceptable parameters. 5 women, I said, and my partner. He held my gaze. He didn't apologize, and he didn't flinch, and he didn't pretend the math was other than it was. Yes, he said. Your assessment is correct. Those were the costs. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, you have a choice here. You can make this complicated. In which case, people get hurt, and the building gets damaged, and the negotiation collapses publicly, and everyone loses what they were trying to preserve. Or you can come with us and let the process work. He looked at me with the expression of a man hearing his own argument return to him. You have a choice, I said again. That's the thing your people sometimes forget about us. We give people choices. Even people who've given none. Gray moved to Orlok's right. Psst. Westenra moved to his left, without being asked, without a signal. Just the coordination of 2 people who had understood the geometry of the situation. I walked straight toward Orlok with my identification in my left hand and my handcuffs in my right, which is a very ordinary piece of kit, very human, very blunt.
Hold it.
He was under arrest for conspiracy in the murders of 5 women and 1 detective, for the development of a prohibited biological agent in contravention of the bilateral accords, the unauthorized manipulation of the integration negotiation, and for the conduct of a covert influence operation against the administration of this city-state. He looked at the handcuffs. Something in his expression shifted. Not into the dramatic register of someone being humiliated, but into the quiet recalibration of someone who has encountered a variable they did not adequately account for, and is incorporating it now. An organism without enhanced capability, without centuries of experience, arriving at the correct door. He extended his wrists. I put the cuffs on. He went with us. He didn't resist. Not because he couldn't. He could have gone through all 3 of us and been 3 floors up and out of the building before Calmet's security responded. He went with us because he was old enough and rational enough to recognize when a board position has become unplayable. Can fight the detective. The evidence remains. You can run from the moment. The case stays open. The sub-level facility was sealed and documented, and the relevant authorities were called in. Flint inside, and the look on his face, when we opened the door, was the look of a man who's been making a private calculation about his choices for 2 years, and has just had the calculation interrupted by the door opening. He didn't resist either. He sat down on a lab stool and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor with the expression of someone whose arrangement with the future has just been renegotiated without his input. Cross we found 2 hours later. Fine, he was at the third safe house. The one Boudreaux hadn't given us. The one I'd found by working through the intercept summaries in Westenra's folder until I found an address listed as a storage rental in the Port District that appeared in 3 separate logistics communications in proximity to route arrangements that matched Cross's established pattern of movement. Gray confirmed the inference was sound, and we went in with 4 of the Elders' enforcement officers, who were the most efficient people I have ever seen conduct a search and arrest. They moved through the building in a silence that was not the silence of training, but of nature, of things that were built for this work in ways that my species simply isn't. Cross fought. He was fast and strong, and he had centuries of accumulated experience in violence. The kind of experience that doesn't live in muscle memory, but in something deeper, in the actual body, in the reactions that happen before the mind is consulted. He was also outnumbered by 4 things that were faster and had more centuries, and I stood at the back of the room and watched the geometry of it work itself out. It wasn't long. Violence between things at that level is not long. He looked at me, afterward, restrained and bleeding, from a gash above one eye that was closing as I watched it. He looked at me with the amber glow eyes, the same eyes I'd seen over Phil's shoulder in the warehouse on Voss Street, and he said, "You're the one who wouldn't stop." "That's correct," I said. I thought about that. The honest answer was several answers, so I gave him the honest answer. Because it's my job. Because Phil deserved better than accidental death on a ministry form. Because you killed 5 women who had names I know now and families who are still sitting in their apartments, waiting to be told something that makes sense. I took my handcuffs out. Gray assisted with getting Cross's arms positioned, because Cross was not cooperating in that particular step. And partly, I said, because nobody thought I'd get here, and I find that motivating. He stared at me. Not with contempt, with the specific expression that Orlok had called admiration, and that I find less flattering than Orlok seemed to think I should. The look of something very old, encountering something that surprised it. We walked him out into the gray morning light of the Port District, and he squinted against it. Involuntarily, the way you do when brightness arrives faster than you've adjusted for. The next several weeks were not simple. The story does not end clean in the bureaucratic sense, and I have never trusted stories that do. Orlok went into a custody arrangement that was negotiated at levels above anything I had clearance for, in conversations between people whose titles don't appear on any public record. Told the arrangement was secure. I was told the biological research was contained. I was given a written summary of what would happen to the materials Fleming had developed, which was 3 paragraphs of carefully constructed language that did not, on a second or third reading, actually specify what would happen to them. Kept the document. I keep most documents. The negotiation was suspended formally for 3 days, and then resumed under different terms. The elder appeared in a brief publicly disclosed statement, not on any broadcast, not with any particular fanfare. Just a document filed with the Interior Ministry and made available to certain journalists under a managed disclosure process that Calmet's office coordinated with help I didn't entirely follow. The statement said that the elders community had identified and addressed a security threat arising from within their own structures, had cooperated with human law enforcement, and wished to proceed with the integration framework. It was careful and formal, and it contained less than it appeared to contain, which is usually what official statements contain, when the full story is too complicated for an official statement. Gray told me later that the elder had known about Orlok for longer than Westenra had admitted. Not the full scope of it, not the pathogen, not Fleming, not the depth of the operational network, but that Orlok had been playing a long game. Yes, that the elder had hoped Orlok could be managed rather than confronted, that the confrontation had been postponed past the point where postponement was responsible. The elder's admission of that, in private, to Gray, was apparently a significant moment in their community's internal politics. Wasn't there for it. I only know what Gray chose to tell me, which is what I deserved for not being in the room. was found in a transit hotel in the Port District 3 weeks later, brought back under guard, and processed through a channel that didn't produce a public record. Whatever became of him, I was not informed. Fleming's work was seized, and the question of what to do with what he'd developed became a matter of closed-door argument that was, from what I gathered, still ongoing when I stopped being briefed on it. Some things in this city do not resolve. They become managed instead, which is not the same thing, and everyone knows it. Westenra found me in the parking structure, the evening after Cross's arrest, when Gray had gone back to the elders' offices to file the operational report, and I was standing next to my car, not especially moving in any direction. She said she'd wanted to speak to me without Gray present. Not because she didn't trust him, but because some things are easier to say to someone you don't share a history with, she said. The elder asked me to convey his personal acknowledgement of what you did, not official gratitude, that will come through the proper channels, and it will be formal and will mean less. He wanted me to tell you that he has been doing this work, the work of building something between our peoples, for a very long time, and that he has learned to read the individuals who make a difference in it, versus the individuals who are simply present when things happen. He says you are the former. He wanted you to know he sees the difference. I thought about that for a moment. Tell him, I said, that I was doing my job, that's all it was. She looked at me steadily. He'll know you said that, she said. He'll find it consistent with his assessment. She left. I stood in the parking structure for another few minutes, listening to the structure settle and creak in the way old concrete does, and then I got in my car and drove home through the gray city. Calmette called me into his office the morning the negotiation formally resumed. He sat behind his desk and looked at me for a long moment, in the way of a man deciding how honest to be with someone he owes an honest accounting to, but isn't entirely sure how to give it. Told to work the case and share findings, he said. Yes, sir, I said. You were not told to break into sub-level 3 of this building. No, sir, I said. You were not told to effect the arrest of a figure involved in the integration negotiation without authorization from this office. No, sir. He was quiet for a moment. Do you have anything to say about that? I had probable cause at each decision point, I said, and I had a partner whose judgment I trusted. His read of the evidence matched mine at every stage. Your partner is a vampire, Calmette said. He's also the best investigative mind I've worked with in 26 years, I said. His instincts are sound and his method is sound. The facts of what he is don't change the quality of his work. Calmette was quiet. Outside his narrow window, the gray city did its gray city business. Vehicles, pedestrians, the flag of the Interior Ministry stirring in a wind that never quite reached the street. Gray has requested you as his permanent investigative partner, he said, under the integrated enforcement framework that the new accord will establish. Joint jurisdiction, bilateral protocols, a defined operational structure. I asked what the training involved. How to work effectively with personnel whose biology and capabilities differ significantly from your own, he said. How to operate within a legal framework that covers both communities simultaneously. Cultural orientation. Historical context. I thought about Gray reading that warehouse with his careful eyes and his patient method. I thought about Westenra setting a folder on a table and holding the weight of a decision she hadn't made, but was accountable for anyway. I thought about the camps, about how some of them came through with their ethics intact. I'll take the assignment, I said. He nodded. He turned back to his desk. I collected my things and walked out through the marble lobby and into the gray city. Gray was waiting by the car. He had 2 cups of coffee, one for each of us. He handed mine over without commentary. Calmette told you, he said. He did, and I drank the coffee. It was better than the precinct coffee, and I didn't ask where he'd gotten it. I've got reading to do, I said. Cultural orientation, historical context. There is a great deal of it, he said. How long does the curriculum take? At the standard pace, he considered. Centuries. You can cover the relevant portions in a few months. Then we'd better start, I said. We got in the car. What I know now that I didn't know when this started is that the thing Orlok called admirable, the variable he'd watched for centuries and still didn't fully account for, the element that his very long life and very sophisticated plan hadn't weighted correctly, isn't stubbornness. It isn't persistence in the mechanical sense. It's something quieter and harder to name. It's the capacity to sit with doubt and keep working anyway. To know that the map is wrong, that the territory is larger and stranger than you prepared for, that you are going to get hurt in it, and that things you trust are going to turn out to be other than what they appeared, and to decide that this is acceptable. That the person who died deserves the work even when the work is frightening. Even when the institutions above you are telling you to file the paperwork and go home. Even when the thing you're pursuing is faster than you and stronger than you and has a century start on understanding how the world operates. Orlok had watched humans for centuries. He understood our biology and our psychology and our institutional patterns. He understood the shapes of our alliances and the predictable lines of our betrayals. He had watched generations of us fail exactly the same problems. Watched the same institutional corruptions develop and metastasize and collapse and grow back in the same configurations. Watched us make the same mistakes our grandparents had made, with a confidence that suggested we'd never been told about the grandparents. He cataloged us from the outside, with the patient, analytical distance of a long-lived mind, observing something that changes too fast to be threatening. He understood almost everything. What he discounted, because it resists systematic analysis, because it doesn't scale predictably, because it exists only at the level of one individual deciding what they owe a dead man, and then acting on that decision in the dark. When nobody is watching and nobody will know the difference, is that a human detective who has been told to stand down will sometimes simply not stand down, not for institutional loyalty, not for career advancement, not because he's run the numbers and arrived at a rational justification, just because Phil had daughters and a photograph of a brown trout and a chest compressed by one deliberate hand, and accidental was the wrong word, and someone had to make it right, because the case is not a file, because behind the file is a locker with a photograph in it, and behind the photograph is a river that a man found by walking toward the sound of water. All it was. That's all it ever is. One person deciding that another person mattered enough to do something about it, past the point of convenience, past the point of institutional permission, past the point of common sense. Orlok had centuries of data. He still couldn't model it. I find that interesting. I suspect I'll find it more exciting the longer I work alongside things that have centuries of data and keep being surprised by what a human being will do when the case matters enough. I don't know if Gray fully understands it yet. He is patient and he has time, and I expect one day he'll arrive at it. He comes close sometimes. I see it in the way he works a scene, the way he follows an evidence thread past the point where a rational assessment of odds would tell you to stop. Maybe that's what centuries do to you if you carry your ethics carefully. Maybe they give you enough time to learn the thing that humans have to figure out fast or not at all. That the case matters, because the person mattered. Full stop, the city is gray and the case is closed. Somewhere in the building on sublevel 3, a team is working through what Fleming left behind. It's going to take a while. Most things worth doing take a while. I'm going to finish this coffee, and then I'm going to go read the orientation materials. Phil would have had opinions about all of it. He'd have been wrong about half of them and right about the half that mattered, the way he usually was. He'd have complained about the coffee. He'd have asked about Lucy Westenra, with the particular sideways curiosity that he deployed when he was interested in something, but wanted to seem like he was just asking. He'd have found the fish. I miss him in the way that you miss someone whose absence has become a fixed feature of your landscape. Always there, always real, not something that diminishes. You don't close that case. You carry it and you keep working. That's the job.